Hare Om Namaha. When His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada left physical manifestation in late 1977, what was his wish for the management of his branch of the Hare Krishna movement? It seems only logical that something strongly akin to the managerial style and form that he first inaugurated in the mid-60s should remain how he wanted management to be continued. For the 11 years he was here with us, despite the formation of the Governing Body Commission in the early 70s, which was an expansion, his management paradigm did not actually change in either essence or its practical day-to-day implementation. His management paradigm was prescriptive. The prescription was the right. It included the acharya, vichara, and prachara, which he authorized for his disciples. It was meant to purify his initiated disciples, including those who he recognized as managers or sannyasis. The right was meant for each and every one of his disciples to become perfect Vaishnav. That would mean that they were also meant to become gurus in their own right via the right. Quote, "Everyone will take all my disciples. If you want, you can take also. But if you follow, they are prepared to sacrifice everything, so they'll take the leadership. I may, one, go away, but there will be hundreds, and they'll preach. If you want, you can also become a leader. Everyone, all my disciples, they are leaders. As purely as they follow, they become leader. If you want to follow, you can become a leader. Leader means one who has become first-class disciple. He is leader. Evam parampara prapta, one who is perfectly following." Unquote. The guru must be a very perfect man. Following means following the prescription, and after that, you can become guru. The real leader gives the prescription for spiritual perfection, and the conditioned disciples following him accept the prescription. As such, Prabhupada's paradigm was prescriptive. Analogously, he was the perfect head physician. His appointed and recognized servants were the authorized interns in training. And if they made some significant advancement, they were meant to help treat the rest of his disciples as those newcomers entered various treatment centers called temples or centers, whether already initiated or in the process of qualifying for genuine initiation from a genuine guru. Concerning the prescriptive paradigm, here are 3 excerpts demonstrating it. Quote, "Reading of the literature and hearing of the chanting is the medicine, and prasadam is the diet. So if diet and medicine are properly administered, the disease of Maya will be cured. But the physician must be always healthy. People may not say, 'Physician is ill thyself.' That means the preachers must be of highly elevated character, following strictly the rules and regulations and chanting regularly." Unquote. Quote, "Those who come to learn must admit that they do not know who they are. or do they not know who is God? And they must be prepared to take to this process. If I go to the physician and ask him, will you please tell me all about medicine and I'll write it down? Is that possible? No. You must take to the process. You must enter the medical school, take your internship, and do so many things. Like this, if you want spiritual knowledge, you must take to the process and follow the principles, unquote. Quote, spiritual life means to become pure, and chanting Hare Krishna will automatically make you pure. But just as when a physician prescribes a certain medicine, he also describes the conditions under which the medicine will be most effective. The chanting will have the most effect if you can abide by the principles of purified living, unquote. His bhakti process, a yoga process, entailed and entails following the yogic principles demanded by Prabhupada, which are herein compared to the prescription of the expert physician. His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada was that expert physician. The process he gave was prescriptive. It was a set process of actions and principles. The managers also had to follow the prescriptions, but nevertheless, they were authorized to treat devotees who were inferior to them. The process Prabhupada gave was not an enterprise. The centers were never meant to be enterprises. The temple presidents, sannyasis, and commissioners were not authorized to be entrepreneurs and concoct their own ways and means in order to treat or train anyone who came to them. The expert acharya, capital A, the founder acharya, capital A, the Sampradaya Acharya, capital A, was meant to sit upon his own divine throne, was meant to be kept in the center, and was meant to be known as always superior to the managers who worked under him according to his directions. Those men, even if they became regular gurus, which none officially did, were to keep the founder acharya as the only man to be worshipped. This was the prescriptive formula. Now, one side note. As per what was introduced last month, quotes from purports and excerpts from letters will not be attributed in the podcast itself. Their sources are found in the endnotes. Aside from this, another innovation has been introduced this month, and it's the subheaders, which will be read as they are. In other words, subheaders are never complete sentences. Now back to the chief point. When Prabhupada's paradigm was changed, his movement deviated. In the spring of 1978, so-called gurus divided up the world into guru zones after he departed, and those radicals were entrepreneurs who were left on their own. They wanted their enterprises, and they were able to manipulate them into effect. They were never authorized to take exalted worship from their god brothers, their god sisters, or newcomers, but they did so. As soon as the zonal acharya debacle was imposed, the medicine of Prabhupada's prescriptive paradigm was converted into an invalid prescription. It was then nothing more than a show bottle, colored water in a glass, which looks like medicine, but when you take it, it does not work. Worse than that so-called medicine was counterproductive to spiritual health, and it transformed the movement. Thus, the zonal disaster, which was implemented in a kind of pseudo-spiritual smash and grab, was the resultant, and it soon enough crashed and burned. When those 11 pretenders, assisted by co-conspirators and hatchet men, received GBC imprimatur, they were very ruthless in how they kept everyone under their thumbs. In effect, they gave the double-barrel middle finger to all of their god brothers and god sisters, practically daring any of them to oppose those new god men in their zones, which were imitations of GBC zones, of course. After an unpleasant 8-year run, they couldn't pull it off. They went way too far. They were not even regular gurus, yet they had the audacity to pretend to be Mahabhagavats. In actuality, they were nothing more than imitation Prabhupads, and the whole make-show was ludicrous. This became apparent to everyone in due course of time, but some, let us say a handful, of Prabhupada's initiated disciples spotted the new paradigm for what it actually was right from the gate, your host speaker included. Prabhupada had only authorized regular gurus. Quote, "When I order you become guru, he becomes regular guru, that's all. He becomes disciple of my disciple, that's it." Unquote. As most of you know, this statement was from early in 1977, although approaching the halfway mark of that final year that Prabhupada was with us. Did he recognize any regular gurus? Did he appoint any of them? Actually, he did not. There is still so much false propaganda being bandied about, even on Joe Rogan's podcast recently, to the effect that Prabhupada appointed 11 gurus to carry on his mission after he departed. That is a false presupposition. It is a false reading of that all-important May 1977 room conversation with his governing body commissioners, the vast majority of whom showed up for it. Most importantly, it was never a part of the prescriptive paradigm that Prabhupada authorized. He was asked 2 questions during that meeting. He was asked what to do in terms of initiating newcomers then, as a lot of them had remained uninitiated for many months, because the leaders of the movement stopped the initiation process worldwide. They did so for a valid reason. They did not want Prabhupada to have to absorb the sanchita karma of these people in his very debilitated physical condition. The curtailment of the initiations was a right decision by the movement's leaders. Yet, since that huge group was building on a daily basis, actually, Prabhupada was asked by one of his sannyasis, who was also a GBC, what was to be done about it. Prabhupada's answer was to reinstate the Ritvik process of initiation. It had been going on for about 7 years. Then it was stopped during this awkward interlude when His Divine Grace was extremely ill. And everyone knows he was extremely ill because he didn't last much longer than that. It led to his death in November, his disappearance. The process, which had gone on for many years previous to its curtailment, was known as initiation from Prabhupada via a Ritvik representative. It began in 1970, and it dominated thereafter until it became the initiation system, even when Prabhupada was on his Vyasasan during initiation ceremonies. For example, your host speaker received both formal initiations from Prabhupada via Ritviks, but Prabhupada was present at those initiation ceremonies, and he was the chief witness of them. He also spoke to me in 1974, and actually, check that. He also spoke to me in 1972 when giving me my first japa beads at the first initiation, Harinam initiation at the Moundsville compound. At my second initiation in 1974, just one day prior to the large ceremony in the temple room, Prabhupada draped the Brahminical thread around my shoulder and showed me how to chant the Gayatri mantra on the fingers. I was alone with him at that time. Perhaps that was the initiation itself, but there was a large formal ceremony in the temple the next day. In 1977, all initiations were stopped for some months. Then, as per Prabhupada's authorization in late May, the Ritvik system was reinstated, but Ritviks were not named until the second week of July of that year. As such, the first half of 1977 also demarcated a timestamp in which there were no new initiations by Prabhupada in his branch of the Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness. As just mentioned, there was also a second question during that all-important meeting in late May, the room conversation. This one was very touchy, and everyone can understand why such was the case. Prabhupada was asked how initiations were to be conducted after he, quote, was no longer with us, unquote. That's when he said that they were to be conducted by qualified gurus. He introduced the term regular guru at that time. But although the term itself was new, the concept was not at all new. Quote, the statements of Thakur Bhaktivinoda are as good as scriptures because he is a liberated person. Generally, the spiritual master comes from the group of such eternal associates of the Lord, but anyone who follows the principles of such ever-liberated persons is as good as one in the above-mentioned group. The gurus from nature's study are accepted as such on the principle that a person who is liberated acharya and guru cannot commit any mistake. But there are persons who are less qualified or not liberated, but still can act as guru and acharya by strictly following the disciplic succession, unquote. Quote, stage 13, he must not take on unlimited disciples. This means that a candidate who has successfully followed the first 12 items can also become a spiritual master himself, just as a student becomes a monitor in class with a limited number of disciples. Item 14, he must not pose himself as vastly learned man simply by quoting statements in books. He must have solid knowledge of the necessary books without superfluous knowledge in others, unquote. Clearly, by these self-evident references. An initiated disciple of a bona fide spiritual master, particularly if that spiritual master is actually a Mahabhagavat, can accept disciples and initiate them, creating a connection to the Guru Parampara despite not being liberated. The last mentioned reference, the 2 items, 2 stages, is an easy journey to other planets. And it clearly is in relation to a devotee who is not yet liberated. This is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt when the 6 more advanced qualifications, namely items 15 through 20, reveal future levels of purified consciousness that must still be attained by the monitor guru. As such, whether you choose to call this advanced devotee who's acting as guru a madhyam guru, meaning a madhyam udhikari who is initiating disciples and taking their sanchita karma, or a monitor guru, or a regular guru, he is not at all limited to being a Ritvik acharya. He's guru. The Ritvik initiates newcomers on behalf of an established guru. The disciple is not an initiated disciple of the Ritvik. The Ritvik performs the ceremony, and it's really no big thing. This system was essential to the prescriptive paradigm that Prabhupada implemented when his movement was growing exponentially. In May of 1977, he reinstated that Ritvik system. New Ritviks required to be named by him at that time, or very soon thereafter, in order for it to be immediately re-implemented, but they were not so named. This naming of the Ritviks was delayed until July, 2nd week. Although all of those 11 men who were then named in July had previously served in authorized capacities as Ritviks. Those services had been curtailed, but now 11 of them, and please note, there were far more than 11 Ritviks previously active before the curtailment. Now those 11 of them were recognized and formally named to initiate newcomers as what? As disciples of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, not disciples of the Ritviks. That all the new disciples were initiated disciples of Prabhupada was clearly stated in the document which named the Ritviks in the 2nd week of July of 1977. The newcomers were not the initiated disciples of any of those 11 Ritvik acharyas, as far as Prabhupada actually naming any regular gurus officially. He never did this. There's no record of it. He only named Ritviks. It is mistaken knowledge to believe that Ritviks become regular gurus after the spiritual master leaves physical manifestation. What to speak of any of them becoming Mahabhagavats or successors? From prescriptive managers to pretender Mahabhagavats. There is no question that the transition from prescriptive management of Prabhupada's ISKCON movement during the period in which it functioned properly to what followed was both a transformation and a paradigm shift. It was a major, egregious, and completely negative deviation. Although it had an abrupt element, from the more accurate perspective, it was gradual. The paradigm shift that was part of the first transformation of the spring of 1978 was the resultant of a malefic weed that had been growing in Prabhupada's movement since the mid-70s. keeping Prabhupada in the center as the real acharya, capital A, the acharya in the true sense of the term, was at the fulcrum of his prescriptive management system. All the centers or temples only worship the Supreme Lord and his perfect representative, the Sampradaya Acharya, capital A, Srila Prabhupada. Keeping Prabhupada in the center was integral to his management system operating in the right way. Quote, I wish that each and every branch shall keep their independent identity and cooperate, keeping the acharya in the center. On this principle, we can open any number of branches all over the world. The Ramakrishna Mission works on this principle, and thus, as an organization, they have done wonderfully, unquote. This was the essence of Prabhupada's prescription, but it was completely busted down and converted in the spring and summer of 1978. Still, the centrifugal energy underlying that transformation had been tearing the movement apart previously. The first transformation brought in the imitation of GBC zones in the form of guru zones. This Prabhupada never wanted nor authorized. Each of its 11 zonal acharyas in those zones, as they came to be known, they became to be known as zonal acharyas. Each of them set up his own brand in his zone, and it never centered around Prabhupada. As could only be expected, it centered around each guru in each specific zone that he controlled. And the inmates came to both want it and love it. For example, in his zone, TKG went so far as to order his disciples, along with the few Prabhupada initiates remaining, not to read any of Prabhupada's books, but to read only TKG's books. As far as the governing commissioners were concerned, if they were not part of the Pretender Guru Club, they had no power whatsoever, although technically their zones continued to exist. No temple president was going to listen to a GBC because his advice might even slightly, or wrongly interpreted to be, in deviation from what the zonal acharya wanted and what the zonal acharya was preaching to his zonal disciples. That temple president wasn't going to risk his position if that were to take place. So, in effect, a new orthodoxy, we're using that noun rather loosely here, obviously, a new orthodoxy emerged in 1978. Actually, 11 new ones emerged. Each so-called orthodoxy was not meant to create perfect men, but instead was meant to create, and did create, slaves and serfs. The Guru zones functioned like Machiavellian kingdoms during the Renaissance, with the zonal acharya as the prince of his principality. However, unlike the Renaissance, a bureaucracy did not emerge at that time. It would come later, and it will be especially described in detail next month. This is a two-part series. Reading Prabhupada's books? You've got to be kidding me. No one was interested in that. That's not how you made, quote-unquote, spiritual advancement in the zonal acharya's principality. You made that advancement by pleasing him with the pick, which was no longer measured in terms of book distribution. This was not only because book distribution was no longer emphasized, which was the case in every Guru zone. It was more the fact that books were not even used anymore in order to collect from the public at large. Recognition from the Guru of his zone was both the means and the end. You are not for a moment considered advanced in anything unless you were pleasing him. The presidents of each center became placeholders assigned to operate those centers for the purpose of the pick. Yes, this was going on to a significant extent prior to Prabhupada's disappearance, and that, at least in general, has already been mentioned here. However, the operation exploded to blatant and egregious proportions after the 11 gurus set up shop in their demarcated principalities throughout the world. Tattvamasi. Training in so-called ISKCON? Forget about it. What came to pass in the first transformation was a paradigm shift that was anything but training a transcendentalist in Brahminical culture and spiritual life. Instead, it encompassed a kind of fever and covert pandemonium. It provided a great deal of opportunity for sense gratification, and that was integral to holding the whole scheme together. Any specific zone was under some limited control, but mostly because the inmates had to surrender what they collected out in the field, and they had to surrender that collection to the hatchet man running their platoon on behalf of his commander-in-chief. A kind of quote-unquote best of both worlds ethics not only took hold, but it was even preached. The president operated his center with a skeleton crew of mostly misfits, space cadets, chelas, kickmes, and pedophiles, all of whom could not get jacked up enough to hit it out on the malls or in the parking lots. The only quote-unquote training was in collection read rip-off techniques, except for some basic ceremonial routines required to keep deity worship going. That was mandatory in order to maintain the pretense that the centers were functioning according to the previous paradigm, which they most definitely were not. The real ISKCON tradition, and we don't use quotation marks there around the acronym, was already mentioned. Reading literature, the divine literature, the sacred text, and hearing and chanting as the medicine. If the diet and medicine were properly administered, then the disease of Maya would be cured. However, if improperly initiated disciples of bogus zonal acharyas were up on the altar while offerings were being made to their pictures, how was that producing prasadam? The real system required the chief physician to be always healthy. In terms of another analogy, this would also move downline to include the temple presidents and the sannyasis who guided the rest under them. In the beginning, let's call it 1966 through 77, let us say that all of them or most of them were genuine, and thus the movement was functioning according to its true tradition, which Prabhupada established. Now, Prabhupada's movement was certainly not as strict as what Siddhanta Sarasvati's tradition had established, but Prabhupada's movement was nevertheless bona fide. The head physician was the founder acharya. In terms of the analogy, he was always perfectly healthy, and we don't need an analogy for that. We know he was. Problems developed over time, especially in relation to the GBC. There was the first attempt at creating a centralization scheme. If the GBC had fully followed through with it in early 1972, that centralization would have killed the movement. Quote, "Do not centralize anything. Each temple must remain independent and self-sufficient. That was my plan from the beginning. Why you are thinking otherwise? Once before, you wanted to do something centralizing with your GBC meeting, and if I did not interfere, the whole thing would have been killed. Do not think in this way of big corporation, big credits, centralization. These are all nonsense proposals. Management, everything, should be done locally by local men. Accounts must be kept, things must be in order and lawfully done, but that should be each temple's concern, not yours. Krishna consciousness movement is for training men to be independently thoughtful and competent in all types of departments of knowledge and action, not for making bureaucracy. Once there is bureaucracy, the whole thing will be spoiled, unquote. We shall return to this later in our presentation here. The first fact, as just mentioned, is that if Prabhupada had not interfered with the centralization scheme of 1972, the whole movement would have been murdered. The movement had been run and continued to be run on a paradigm that was prescriptive. It was simple, even as it expanded. It was to think and act locally for the purpose of the center, which was then known as part of an international mosaic benefiting the center's members as well as all the members as well as the world at large. This was the tradition that Prabhupada established, but it was crushed in the late 70s. Again, what wound up as the first transformation of the zonal acharya debacle was already active in the movement in the mid-70s before Prabhupada disappeared. Reading and studying as a congregation and individually were continually, day after day, week after week, month after month, minimized. Bhagavad Gita classes at night were disappearing almost everywhere by 1975. The pick was everything. As a result, Sankirtan chanting on the streets was becoming almost non-existent, whereas it had been a daily affair at all U.S. centers in the early 70s. I know that from practical experience. And then, in the mid-70s, grains were cooked, offered, and eaten on Ekadashi, allegedly for energy for the pick. Personality cults were forming, especially for Kirtanananda, TKG, and Hansaduta, and these would morph into the 11 Pretender Mahabhagavat worship in 1978. The prescriptive tradition was being replaced, but it was completely trashed by the spring and summer of 1978. A new, quote-unquote, traditional society was established as its replacement. One guru morphed into 11 so-called gurus. One movement, running via localized management at over 100 centers worldwide, was converted into 11 movements run in different ways, despite some prosaic similarities here and there. There was carryover into this new so-called orthodoxy, but that, as could only be expected, waned over time. The first transformation was a new paradigm. The ideas, the values, and its belief system were adapted to pleasing each guru in his zone. And now the basic beliefs remained, but after that, others on the margin were subject to transformation, rarely in totality, but more often subtly and covertly. And few of the new disciples cared either way. 11 commissioners became incumbent elites. They were the older elites. In effect, they were the grand bourgeoisie. However, as I already mentioned, bureaucracy did not emerge in the first replacement paradigm. This is important to know and realize. In the first transformation, everything still remained small-scale and zonal. It remained non-technical. It was a basic paradigm. It was not caught up in any sophisticated modernization from the outside world, at least not initially. The pick is what it mostly operated, as had been the case in the latter stage of the declining prescriptive model. The businesses that emerged in the zones, for the purpose of revenue for the guru, of course, they're all small scale. They were not centralized. None of those gurus, their presidents or enforcers, were long-term oriented, and they certainly not group-oriented outside of their zone. And there was little vision. Everyone was programmed to seek ever-increasing immediate results. The technostructure of the first transformation remained fundamental and particular. The guru represented his zone, and he did not represent the movement. The leftovers, read his god brothers and god sisters, departed the centers over time, and they were replaced by his own devotees, all improperly initiated. It was a new paradigm, no doubt, but it was also still semi-classical in terms of the Vedic matrix, at least mostly so. It was one guru and one zone competing with the other gurus in the other zones, but those competitors, spiritually speaking, were all knuckle draggers in terms of bureaucracy. Individualism was allowed to stalwart followers in each zone under the guru. As far as training was concerned, like before, that almost all centered upon inculcating techniques to be used by collectors out in the pick. The first transformation was utilitarian, and from one perspective it functioned in a kind of Protestant ethic, although certainly it had no relation to any Abrahamic religion. In other words, the accrued personal wealth of the autocrat of the zone, the prince of his principality, could be compared to the personal wealth of a regional business owner. Another way of saying this is that what the oligarch's devotees accrued for his glorification was the proof, allegedly, of the legitimacy of his system, his character, and what he was preaching. There was a kind of eccentric but quasi-aristocratic idealization present in the first transformation. This was never the case during the previous paradigm of the prescriptive method until the weed gained momentum here and there near the end of it. Aristocracy would not have been the case either if the powerful men, after Prabhupada departed manifestation, had acted as regular gurus. Of course, we all know well that they did not follow that prescription, in no small part because they were all budding sahajas and never gurus in the first place. In this late 70s replacement paradigm, which, please note, completely and quickly wiped out the prescriptive paradigm, the centers then acted as individualized institutions dedicated to the guru of the zone, the zonal acharya. Now, there was not actually a zonal consciousness. There was zonal acharya consciousness, with the individualized temple president's personal values representing how his center was run to please the guru of the zone. The gurus remained 11 only for about 5 years of their 8-year truncated reign. They had many servants, yet they could not be bothered to take care of them, what to speak of training them. Those so-called gurus instead imitated Prabhupada, because the whole transformation was based upon 11 great pretenders being imitation Prabhupads. Everything remained quite decentralized. The GBC had much less power than it even had in the mid-70s. just before the pseudo-spiritual smash and grab, which constituted the horrific and illicit takeover of Prabhupada's movement by what Swami B.R. Sridhar first called, quote, the acharyas of the zone, unquote. Concerning the sole acharya model, in and around 1984, the zonal acharya imposition was trending downhill badly, and it then began to be called the sole acharya model, initially by Professor Blueblood. That designation would certainly be appropriate for back in the day, when Prabhupada was the lone initiator in his movement worldwide. However, there are many reasons why the sole acharya moniker should not have been applied to the first transformation after Prabhupada departed physical manifestation. As mentioned already, there was some carryover in 1978. That was to be expected. However, in both formation and process, the zonal acharya imposition was a different paradigm from what it replaced and destroyed. The following evidence of this comprises just some of those reasons why the moniker, the sole acharya model, should not be used to describe it. First, there were 11 of them instead of just one. Soul means one. Secondly, there were also 11 guru zones. Most importantly, the zonal acharya scam was unauthorized, whereas what Prabhupada established was completely authorized along with his adjustments. Next, none of those 11 were supposed to be anything but regular gurus. They did not act as regular gurus, however, since they imitated Prabhupada. They should never have been called sole acharyas because they were all sahajias and never acharyas at any time. Nor were they regular gurus, which is all that Prabhupada authorized, although he did not specifically designate, at least not officially, any of his disciples to having attained the status of regular guru. Returning to process. When one zonal guru visited another one, both of those bogus gurus' pictures were desecrating the altar worshipped by the local pujaris for that center. Prabhupada only allowed departed, God-realized spiritual masters in his line of disciplic succession to have their pictures on the altar, and that never included any of his godbrothers. This is another evidence that what so-called ISKCON concocted was not a sole acharya model. The zonal debacle only carried over a few remnants from the previous sole acharya model. Is there a record of any of those 11 men employing ritviks they had appointed to chant on japa beads and pour ghee at imitation ceremonies? However, back in the day, for all practical purposes, ritvik was the only process of initiation in Prabhupada's movement for all of the 70s. Thus, proper application of a ritvik system for one guru is evidence of a sole acharya model. Did it ever go down in the first transformation? If it did, was it widespread? Not much evidence of it, if any. Because the zonal acharya paradigm was empowered, and we're not talking spiritual empowerment here, because the zonal acharya paradigm was empowered by both Swami B.R. Sridhar and the vitiated GBC, each of those entities could work to disempower it, which is exactly what transpired, especially in the 80s. The sole acharya model of Prabhupada had no such dependencies. The chief reason for this is that for his movement, he always remained the only guru. S-O-L-E, soul, means only. As such, in his movement, it could only be destroyed from within by his leading secretaries after he left. And that's exactly what happened. In other words, those 11 men of the first transformation were not sole gurus on the strength of their own learning and personal charisma. In order to convert their actual and temporary status as Ritviks into that of alleged Mahabhagavats, they took help, read dependent upon, an elderly godbrother of Prabhupada and imprimatur from the vitiated governing body commission. As far as carryover is concerned, any and all of that was nothing more than perverted reflections of the actual sole acharya paradigm. There can be no doubt that the paradigm established by those 11 great rogues was different from what was actuated by Prabhupada. Due to those aforementioned two dependencies, the zonal imposition had the seeds of its own destruction embedded in it right from the gate. However, it could have, and you could argue should have, lasted longer than it did. It had many enemies, but it was also making dedicated devotees, read fanatics, who could have and would have upheld it if not for egregious personal transgressions that soon became known to everyone in the movement. Also, the enmity of some of the second echelon, we're talking Prabhupada's initiates here, that enmity against it, the zonal arrangement of the 11, that enmity could have been handled much better. Many, if not most, of those who crossed the river and linked up with the Navadvip Mahant could have and should have been kept in so-called ISKCON. That migration could have been avoided if those sannyasis, most of them being sannyasis, were given more power and put on a course to becoming the gurus in so-called ISKCON. If the 11 had been bona fide gurus, they would have done just that. But they weren't gurus. As such, they were indirectly responsible for Niyamat, which plagues so-called ISKCON to this day. If the 11 had been bona fide, then someone like Jayatirtha would never have engaged in his shocking displays of Sahajism. However, he did, and the 11 mismanaged that situation, big time. They also proved to be counterproductive, but bogus gurus are prone to mismanagement. How could it be otherwise? Another issue was building, a movement-wide backlash. It was kept in check through deception and intimidation, but it built up power during its incubation period. When unleashed by all those who had been feeling it for many years, its power was a potent force. That backlash led to the North American Temple Presidents rebelling, which was a death knell for the zonal acharya imposition. However, the real reasons why the zonal scam collapsed, the real reasons are twofold. First, there was the egregious manifestations of fall down by so many of those 11 quote-unquote Mahabhagavats. And those fall downs, many of them, but not all of them, were in the category of illicit sex, both heterosexual and homosexual. Second, there was vicious infighting between gurus. Not all were implicated in it, but some pairs were antagonistic to their counterparts, harboring similar bad intent and loathing. Thus, inimical camps were created, almost always in contiguous zones, resulting in very deleterious propaganda about the other so-called Mahabhagavat. This caused doubt amongst the Prabhupada disciples, who represented what was still semi-legitimate, or if you prefer, quasi-legitimate. That doubt led to eventual rejection and faithlessness, although not necessarily loss of faith in either Prabhupada or the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It did lead to loss of faith in so-called ISKCON, however. By the mid-80s, that doubt reached a boiling point, and the whole movement was on the verge of cratering. As stated by Prabhupada in a purport in Bhagavad Gita, Satan is ignorance. The first transformation was based upon ignorance, and the paradigm created by it was full of ignorance. That paradigm was not the sole acharya model in actuation. Avidya is integral to its own mode, obviously, and ignorance is necessarily conducive to destruction. The zonal acharya debacle was collapsing, and Satan saw that it was a time for a change. From pretender Mahabhagavats to bureaucratic manipulators. Quote, Krishna consciousness movement is for training men to be independently thoughtful and competent in all types of departments of knowledge and action, not for making bureaucracy. Once there is bureaucracy, the whole thing will be spoiled, unquote. Now, there had to be a change from the first transformation. That change was the second transformation, and it was the collegiate compromise introduced by Professor Blueblood. He initially got his foot in the door with his new management idea via position paper from the latter half of 1984. More position papers would follow, each expanding upon the bureaucratic idea and taking advantage of the collapse of the zonal acharya concoction. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. It has no authority, and it has had no spiritual authority since early 1978. Its gurus are bogus, and the disciples they create are improperly initiated. Its current bureaucratic management scheme is a paradigm that Prabhupada never wanted, does not want, and has never at any time been authorized. Its gurus are now nothing more than institutional employees or rent acharyas. They are prone to egregious fall down, and they are prone to such fall down often because none of them were ever gurus at all. And this has always been the case as far as so-called ISKCON is concerned. In part 2, in next month's presentation, we shall describe the current managerial regime in so-called ISKCON, and we shall describe it in detail. Did the third transformation of the Hindu hodgepodge, did that transformation change the paradigm? Will the coming fourth transformation, already kickstarted, will that change it? These questions and more will be answered next month. Wait for it. Sadeva Samya